Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us. Everybody, welcome back to another episode of Socializing Security. We've got a great episode this week, one that I think Milu and I are both quite excited for and have been really looking forward to. Is with an old friend of ours named Steve Sims. We both worked with him when he was acting at a CISO facility. So he's one of those top level security people that we really want to be talking to and hearing more about. And Steve's got a great background. We'll get into that here in a second. But Mila, just what's your excitement level for talking to Steve this week?
I mean, it's really great when we get to chat with former colleagues and hear what they're working on at the moment, and also just reminisce a little bit. But I'm very much looking forward to chatting with Steve. I think he and I used to work in a complementary capacity where compliance and security were separate functions, which certain organizations have it set up that way. That was kind of new for the org at the time. So I know, he and I definitely worked pretty closely when we were talking about security baselines. And then a lot of the compliance requirements fell on my team, as well as then all of the security configurations fell on his team. So we were very in lockstep in terms of doing audit activities together, assessing our systems, and had some pretty awesome plans for growth. And so, I'm looking forward to hearing what he's been working on in the meantime, because I know he and I are very similar, but come from different backgrounds and different mindsets. So he has more of the technical and I have more of the regulatory, but together we both really care about InfoSec. And so I'm looking forward to just hearing what he's been working on.
Yeah, definitely a great communicator. Definitely thinks outside of his lane and what his work does for others. He came up out of the Air Force, so having to work with a lot of different areas in the Air Force, I've noticed a lot of people coming out of the Air Force have pretty good broad mindset. They don't just narrowly focus on their one thing. From there, he started his own MSSP, managed security services provider, and had a real strong customer focus because of that. Because when you start a business like that, you're the one doing the work at every level at first, and eventually got to the point of being a CISO because he did have that broad view of things. Now, one of his big things, I think what we'll mostly talk about today, is really the fundamentals. And he's big on make sure you've got the basics in place. And so things around, the intersection of compliance and security is not just to satisfy regulation. It's the regulation is there to give you a baseline, a minimum that you have to do from a security perspective. You got to focus beyond that. And in order to focus on the really high-end stuff, the complicated things, introducing XDR and SIMs and no pun intended, and SOAR type platforms, those types of things don't happen in a void. You've got to have some basics in place first. So I think we'll dive pretty heavily into that. Steve also helps with the CompTIA classes and certifications. So I know he's got a strong focus on teaching people and helping people learn. He's taught me a ton in this space as I've made more of a pivot towards the security space from the traditional infrastructure side of things. So yeah, he's the guy I wanted to talk to about this one. And it just so happens that we both know him pretty well and are both excited to have the conversation. So really, really will be interesting to see where it goes.
Yeah, let's bring on Steve.
Hey everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Socializing Security. We're glad to have you listening again. We really appreciate you all tuning in. Milu, how are you doing?
Pretty good. Happy to be here. Looking forward to our conversation with Steve today. So very excited about what we're going to talk about. And I was talking to somebody about the podcast and the experience of recording. And it was just it's pretty cool. It's like a recorded networking session where we just get to talk about things we really care about with some really cool people. And we're sharing it and we're having fun doing it. So yeah, happy to be here.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. And like Milu mentioned, we've got Steve Sims here. We've gave you all a little bit of an intro if you listen to the kind of episode preview that we did before, and are going to talk to him about kind of the basics of security. It kind of feels like a good place to kind of start our interview series of episodes to, kind of focus on that basics. And those are important, and Steve has a heart for that. So, Steve Sims, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience real quick?
Yeah. Hey, thanks, guys. My name is Steve Sims. I'm, as Brian mentioned, former founder of an MSSP, cybersecurity guy, veteran, and honestly, I just love to talk and do all things security, whether it is the basics or getting into the deep, dirty, ugly, dark. I just enjoy it all. So,
Yeah. Yep. Excited to have you on and to talk through some of these, because, sometimes we do get lost in the exciting new big whiz bang stuff, and we forget about the fact that, hey, are you using MFA? That's kind of a basic thing that you should be doing. And we continue to this day to see breaches that happen because of it, which is unfortunate, especially when it's a back-end provider that is providing services to a lot of different companies, and they're getting breached because that service provider gets breached. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then go search, because I'm not going to name names. But with that, let's start talking about all of that. So Steve, I want to start with your founding an MSSP. Kind of what your initial thoughts were going into that, why you felt that was something that was needed at that point, and maybe some of the lessons learned with customers that you worked with there.
Oh man, that's kind of a loaded.
It's a 2-for-1.
I don't know. That's almost a whole episode in and of itself. No, I think kind of the idea behind it was almost like an underserved area of cybersecurity is really in the SMB space. The people that don't necessarily have the budget, don't necessarily have, especially the team, to do it themselves. And so they need help, right? They need experts. I think it's also a very difficult segment of the market to focus on, right? Because again, they don't have the budget. So it's very difficult to provide what I will call, just for the sake of it, world-class security services, right? Enterprise-grade security services, if you will, is hard to provide that at a cost point that makes sense for SMB. And it's even harder to get them to understand the why. And so that was kind of our goal. We started out as a very, very focused organization on just doing the network security side of things, right? A firewall, intrusion detection prevention, DLP, like let's really secure that edge. And at a minimum, we know that barrier, that edge is there and in place. And if we can control a certain amount of that, then it reduces the risk significantly for these organizations that were running off a Comcast router and that's it, or whatever it might be, right? An ISP device and then hello internet. And that's scary, as you guys can imagine, but that's realistically what we were working with. And so, some of the lessons learned are just that. Like how can I get some world-class enterprise grade services at a level, at a price point, at a level, at an understanding that it makes sense for SMB. A lot of these, especially the small, super small organizations, they don't even have an IT person, right? One of our customers was a one-person tattoo shop whose husband is in IT, and she was like, "Well, I know I need to have something because my husband is harping on me all the time, but I don't know anything about this. Like, you give me a tattoo pen or whatever, and I'm game. But I don't know anything about the internet. I don't know anything about this." And then we had everything up to multi-billion-dollar customers, right? That's a different kind of experience, obviously, with them. But initially, just figuring out how to work with small organizations, how to work with people that absolutely have no knowledge of this whatsoever, but still provide them the value that we were providing those multi-billion-dollar organizations that's huge, right? And honestly, that's what it takes. And that's the very scary and sad thing about the job that we have to do here is, maybe maybe the risk profile of a multi-billion-dollar organization is different, but the internet is the same. You're still an IP address out there on the internet, right? And so it's scary. And so I'd say that's probably the biggest thing we started learning. And what we really had to do was just for the purposes of the topic at hand is focus on the basics. We had to get down and say, hey, you can't do these really basic things that you're doing. You can't just go to whatever website and download anything you want on the same system that you access your client records or your financial activity or whatever it happens to be. Like, these are things we need to help you with. And we really had to break it down to the basics to get them to understand some of that stuff.
Yeah. So with that, it sounds like you had to do not only the technical aspects with them, but also some of the education aspects, some of the end user training. A little bit easier when you have just one person who probably isn't using the computer very often to begin with. But may not know good from bad on the internet whatsoever. And obviously very different, like you said, very different when you get out of the SMB, what their needs are and who they have to do things.
Absolutely.
So maybe talk about, you talked about firewall being one of those basic things. What other basics are out there that you really see as things that you can't compromise on? Like, don't even think about doing something fancy until you get these things down.
Well, so I'm a big person that focuses on frameworks, right? The good thing is what we have available today is way different than what we had available 18, 20 years ago, right? Like, we actually have tools to tell us where to start. And if you look at things like, the NIST CSF, the cybersecurity framework, or the CIS Top 18 Critical Controls, which just released version 8.1, which is awesome. For those of you that are part of the space, you'll rejoice along with me. But I think everybody kind of brushes over those first, especially in CIS Top 18, we're talking the first 5 or 6, right? Really the first 3 to 4 are probably the most basic things that you can do. And I'll say what those are in a minute, but they're the most basic things you can do, but people skip over them thinking they're not as important. And then when you go to deploy, something a little more difficult, something a little more, first of all, intrusive into your environment, but also something that requires a lot of input-output, not being trash, not being garbage. It becomes really clear and apparent that these things are the most basic things you need to do. The first one that I will say is inventory control of hardware and software assets, knowing what you have, period. Yep. Right? If you don't know what you have, you can't hope to secure them. Yeah. Within that top 5 or 6 is also secure configuration, but you can't even get to that secure configuration piece without knowing what you have, right? You could have secure configurations for 98 out of 100 devices in your environment, and if you don't know what those 2 things are, and those are the things that is targeted for whatever vulnerability happens to be, none of those 98 matter. It only takes 1. And so those are the kinds of basic things that I'm talking about. And even to the point of, like, so many people in security try to go to immediately to technology solving all the problems, right? Let's go and let's get a deception capability, right? So we're talking effectively honeypot, honey net type of thing that's deceiving a wannabe a malicious person into getting an asset that obviously is not real. You can't possibly mimic something in your environment if you don't know what you have in your environment to mimic, right? The other piece is you don't know what your critical assets are if you don't know what they are, first of all, right? Obviously. But you don't know the critical data that you have and what is worth protecting, what is worth spending the money on that very, very expensive deception piece of equipment if you're not doing the basic inventory actions up front. I mean, I could go on and beat a horse dead forever on all of the things that require knowing what you have and where they are and what you're doing with them, right?
And that's not just about what servers you have, what operating systems, what applications are on there, but would you consider it the basics to be able to get into that almost DLP level, the data loss prevention, and knowing, hey, this particular spreadsheet out here on the file server happens to have social security numbers, and this other one happens to have account numbers. Like, you consider that part of the basics?
Oh, for sure. I think, period, doing anything beyond really just throwing technology at an environment and hoping and praying that it does its job requires, I mean, if you really wanted to do target risk management within your environment, target vulnerability management within your environment, and truly control your risk, you have to know what all those things are, how they're being used, what they're used for, what their criticality is to the business. Like, on a podcast years ago, I used this like really strange concrete pouring company. And I went on this really long tangent about how the concrete trucks, they're critical, but also all these other things, right? Guaranteed those guys know the maintenance records on their dump trucks. They know the maintenance records on their hand compactor and things like that, right? Like, those are the things that tradespeople have been doing forever, right? And just because cybersecurity is new, at this point, I don't know if it's that new, doesn't mean you don't need to do the same things for your company, for your business, and make them a critical asset. If you don't know how they're being used, how critical they are, if a small cement company loses a cement truck or whatever, the critical piece of equipment to their business, they're out, right? They're not bringing home money to their families or their employees' families, right?
Yeah.
The same idea goes for data.
I mean, just hammering that point down, I think like asset management and even like vendor management, when we're saying not only the critical assets, but also which software applications, it's something that startups also really struggle with, in the sense that very often they are bootstrapping and they're like, we need this thing right now and we needed these things. And it takes companies a long time to actually like sit back and be like, no, we actually have to create an inventory of these things and review it and make sure it stays up to date. But this is one of those things. Every company I've worked for has always had struggles with these things. It's like unbelievable how the first thing you always want to ask is like a compliance and security professional is like, what are we using? Like one, who are the people that work for us? Especially, do we have contractors? Do we know who those are? Like, what systems do they have access to? And then also what software we're using, what assets we have, and start there. Because that's like the first thing that I think actually generally takes a while for companies to actually sort out.
What's hilarious is that you said like no company you've worked for is doing it well. It's the funniest thing that people glance over those like first 2, 3, 4 steps, because it seems like they're the easy things. Like, oh, I can get to that later. That's easy. It's not easy, period. Like, especially as your organization grows, the hardest thing to do is take a company that has 10,000 assets and do an inventory of that. That's an absolutely monumental task. But at the same time, to your point, like startups that are hyper growth, right? They're growing super fast. So they're bringing people in, they're bringing equipment in, they're bringing assets in at a very fast rate. Or even these companies that just, they've been around 30 years, right? They have literally no idea what they have. They don't know, right? And so it's not easy to do this and keep up with it. It's a mundane, boring task up front, right? But then as you grow and as you get bigger, that 10,000 asset or 100,000 asset organization trying to do an inventory of that and start fresh, that's next to impossible without a big team and a significant cost, right? And so, if I'm talking about the basics, it's do those things first. Because it only gets harder. It's not something that gets easier as you go along.
Yeah, especially when we consider people adopting the cloud and different SaaS applications and the data being much more distributed, the applications being much less in the team's control, meaning we don't do the installation, we don't do the patches, somebody else does it for us. That stuff just it seems like it gets easier to manage, but in some ways it gets harder to track.
Yeah.
So yeah, I was in a situation where we grew very quickly back in my admin days, and we thought we had control over our infrastructure assets and tracking those things. But in the end, it turned out that we really didn't. And at one point, we just kind of had to put a stake in the ground and say, okay, somebody needs to spend some time just going through and saying, here's all the VMs that we have in our virtualization environment, and here's all the physical servers, and literally somebody has to go into the data center and just go rack by rack and pick out all the things. And then from there, you literally build your way up the stack to find out, okay, what operating systems on there, what applications are on there, what data is contained in there. And this was a long time ago. So things like DLP and inventorying the data itself wasn't really in our mindsets at that point.
Yeah.
But knowing who cared about that data, what business users were using it, became super critical for us. And that started feeding into or getting pushed forward by things like DR and being able to do disaster recovery, things like it was for an insurance company, so they had to understand what their risks were and what they could tolerate and stuff like that, and
it's
sort of become a gnarly mess. It was such a gnarly mess to try and untangle and figure out, but there were real ramifications to it, and we understood what those ramifications were because we were in the business of when stuff hits the fan.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm curious when you talk to companies about these deficiencies, and obviously there's, I just talked about an example of where sometimes it's a hill you have to climb. It's this, okay, we've been ignoring this mountain. Let's start going up it because we have to go do that. But a lot of these really aren't one and done type of situations. And that's a big part of the MSSP model as opposed to of our professional services type model is, okay, we need to continue doing this. This isn't something that we can stop doing.
Right.
So maybe talk a little bit about where maybe not customers failed per se, but where you saw the most need for your team.
Oh man. That's
making me feel real good about these
one.
questions.
That's a good one. First of all, like security and compliance are never a one and done. Like Milu will attest to this as a very compliance focused person. The feedback loop is real. Like you have to do that constant care and feeding of a program, period. Right. I mean, especially when we're talking the basics, every day, potentially, depending on organization size, right? You're making additions or removing devices from the environment, right? That inventory is going to be changing every day, if not more so than that, right? Which means that your risk profile is changing as it goes along, unless you have very strict controls and very clear, concise ideas of how things should happen, right? Which you, by the way, need inventory and all of these things we've already talked about in order to get there. But it's never a one and done. One of the things, like, we focused on firewalls up front, right? And our customers thought, hey, I'll have you come in and just set up this firewall. And then it's not going to be anything to just manage this, right? It's very basic. You're going to have to get into the device and make a change, once every couple months, and that's it. And then they realize that they're growing. And they're bringing on new third-party vendors. They're bringing on new pieces of software. They're bringing on all of these different things that require a touch point within the firewall in order to give access to VPN, in order to provide access externally for a specific device on the inside, right? And so their mindset started to change. The more they had to call us and say, hey, all right, thanks, guys. We just brought in this new piece of equipment. It's an emergency right now, right? Because the guy is here and we need to make this happen, right?
Yep.
Eventually, they also learn that if they involve us early, right? If they have all their ducks in a row, they've done all the basic stuff, and now they're like, hey, in 30 days, in a month, we've got this guy coming. We need these changes in the firewall. Here's the guy's contact information if you need anything else, and we'll be ready to test. So it transitions from this like, oh, you guys don't ever need access. You're never going to have to help us, to, oh man, you guys are making a lot of changes. We're calling you last minute. to this like mature, and I'll use this, but a maturity level from a support perspective of, hey, we're ready for this guy to come in and execute, right? Because we have all of our basics done. We have all of our ducks in a row before this vendor gets on site or whatever it might be, right? And I think the more we were working with folks, again, to your point earlier about education, we weren't just doing the technical work, we were educating. We were making them aware of what's needed, right? But you would see that growth in a customer from, we don't really need you guys, but our compliance guy said we have to have something, so here we are, right? All the way to, hey, you guys are actually a part of our team. We're in buying discussions of potentially buying the software. Here's the documentation on it. Can you guys take a look and see if there's any issues? Like, seeing that maturity journey all the way through that was just an incredible thing to see and witness. And it's because you had that constant care and feeding. You weren't just a one and done kind of a thing. And that growth, obviously forward progress, is what you're looking for as a business overall.
That's cool.
I mean, I think the intention of just hearing you say, right, that one of the most valuable things for you as an MSSP was seeing the program evolution and the buy-in from your customers of understanding not only that they were like, hey, we have to have security. It was, hey, actually security is supposed to be here and they're welcome and we need their expertise and we value them as a trusted partner is, I mean, I think one of the best things that we can like hear as security professionals of being like, wow, like, you like wanted to be there. And yeah, I just feel like just kind of looking back, is that kind of the biggest thing that you took away from as you were doing that, really part of it of being like, hey, that was the most valuable part of it? Or was there another area that you felt like really like stood out to you?
I mean, there's so many lessons learned. When you're growing your own business, it's just every day is a waterfall of learning experiences, right? So, or I should say fire hydrant. It's not a waterfall. It's just taking it straight to the face all day long, right? From a fire hydrant. I don't know. Anyway, it's, you're constantly learning. To say that there's one thing that I learned more than another. I will say, like, it's a very proud moment when you watch the customer make that change, right? We had a few customers that, over 5 or 6 years, we did see very, very clear, honestly, almost roller coaster style, right? Like, they would do really well for a while and then lose focus or have a different project and they'd come down and back up, and happened all the time. But that's one of the most rewarding things, is like having that aha light bulb moment of, hey, these guys can actually help me in more than in business planning and in making the future of this company better, versus just being that guy I have to put a ticket in with to solve a problem that I have last minute on a Saturday night or whatever it might be, right? To see that aha moment, light bulb moment was pretty awesome. It also made it really easy to sign a renewal contract at the end of the term, right? Which is always good.
Yes.
Being valued partners. But I mean, there's something to be said that, like, I think in general, right? Like, there's very often that, certain teams like compliance, IT, security are seen kind of as some of the back end stuff that like are cost centers and maybe aren't like driving business, because people see them as like roadblocks and things that they have to do, as opposed to things that are actually like supporting the business and potentially also inspiring growth and stuff. But there's certain things that without certain security in place or certain compliance standards, like they can't get their foot in the door for certain deals and stuff like that, and continuing to make that business case.
Yeah. There used to be a term, cease no, because the CISO always said no, right? Yeah. And I think we've gotten to the point where we shifted away from that. First of all, there's so many tools available now. Like, you don't have to say no to a business unit that wants to do something. That didn't used to be the case. You almost had to say no because you didn't have a technically feasible way to make it happen on some of these things. We're in such a good spot today versus where we were at before. Like, everything was done via spreadsheet. Let's hope we can script together something to automate some of these functions so we don't have to spend every weekend doing these things, right? Patching or vulnerability scanning or, simple backups, right? Brian's probably very well familiar with
all too.
Let's call it circa 2005 backup ecosystem was ugly.
Yeah. Saved my bacon a few times though, so I won't complain too much.
For sure. That's true. But I think the tools at our disposal to do these things that are hard, that aren't fun, that are mundane, they're boring, they're terrible. Yes, I get it, but they're a requirement. You have to do these basics in order to do anything. You can't accomplish a business impact analysis without doing your inventory. You can't accomplish a backup, a business continuity or disaster recovery plan without executing a business impact analysis, which you can't do without an inventory. You can't even talk to a salesperson who wants to sell you EDR, endpoint detection and response capabilities, unless you know how many assets you have. The number of times that I went in and I said, all right, how many assets do you have in your environment? And they would say, somewhere between 200 and 300. Okay, well, that's a big difference, right? Or larger organizations are even scary. They're like, yeah, we're probably around, 9, 10,000, something like that. And it's like, all right, let's get a real idea of the size of your environment. You can't even get a reasonable quote for something like EDR without having an inventory and without being able to do that. And so I think we have great tools. I think we have the ability to do these basic things a lot easier than we did in the past. But it's still boring. It's still hard. And we still need to do that constant care and feeding of these basic tasks in order to do anything further down the maturity scale of compliance, security, or any of the above, governance, whatever piece of the pie you want to throw at this, you have to do those basic things in order to get there, right?
Yeah, I love that. It's you talked about backup recovery. It's the same backup recovery. Like, you've got to have the basics. You got to make sure that there's a backup there before you move on to the advanced stuff. Like, make sure you can recover that backup. Is equally important, but it is kind of a stair-step approach. You have to start with the first step before you get to the second step.
Yeah, so we're basically saying that, like, the basics are still really, really key to any successful program. And that program maintenance,
absolutely.
while maybe not super sexy, is still really, really important for anybody's longevity.
Yeah, and definitely tools and people out there to help you do it.
Yeah. So, Steve, I have our departing question, and we ask all of our guests this, and I'm really curious to kind of hear where you would land. But I had a CTO recently say to me that they thought that the fight for privacy was dead, and now it's the fight for security. And I would love to just get your thoughts on that.
The fight for privacy is dead. I think, I don't think it's lost. I think we've taken the fight for privacy in the wrong direction. The fight for privacy has been something that has been focused on protecting a company from the ill effects when they don't look and take care of someone's privacy, right? Like, that's such a backwards thing. Protect the guy that's using my data versus protecting the guy whose data it is. And I think we're really backwards there. I don't think the fight is lost, but without sounding anti-capitalist, maybe, we have to do more to hold these organizations accountable, and make that fight about the right person, about the right entity, maybe I should say, versus person. Protect the records. Don't protect the company that holds the records. I honestly think, like, that's the struggle. Now, the fight for security, that changes. Yes, that fight is strong. It has been strong. The problem is we're having this conversation about basics, about fundamental things, and I was doing the same thing back in 2005. like, why am I still talking about inventory and vulnerability management being like the keystone, the very most important thing 20 years later? Like, why are we doing this? Let's solve this once and for all, or at least figure out a way to make it real. Like, it's one step forward, two step backs. It feels like sometimes in the security fight. But as I mentioned 100 times, 5 times in this podcast, the tools that we have available today are incredible, and so much more than we had, 10 years ago, 15, even 20 years ago, of course. But I think it's all a good fight. Like, keep fighting. It's a good fight. The burnout's real, but I think it's a fight worth fighting.
Great.
Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, that was awesome. Great note to end on too. So, Steve, thank you so much for joining us. We really enjoyed the conversation, but we've all known each other for a while, so it was a little bit of a reread for us. But hopefully that came through to be a much more enjoyable conversation for all the audience. And speaking of the audience, thank you all for joining us. We appreciate you socializing with us. We hope you learned along with us, and we hope to have you listen in on the next episode. Take care.
Thanks.
Well, that was a great conversation, as expected, with Steve. Mila, what'd you think?
Yeah, I think we will definitely consider that the champions of asset management is kind of one of the notes that I'm taking away from that conversation. It's refreshing to hear that that's also just the fundamentals are still important. It was nice to just hear that. I'm sure we can get into more of some of the more challenging security baseline standards that, Steve is passionate about, but it was just kind of nice to just hear that, like, sometimes the foundational stuff is really hard for companies to get right in the first place.
Yeah, definitely. And asset management has always been a big one for me. So I was more than happy to just stick on primarily to that one topic. But yeah, there's definitely others. And I guess we don't have to look for an excuse to get Steve back on. We can say, okay, let's go to fundamentals, but put asset management aside. We know that one. Let's talk about the next one.
We all have our asset inventory set up and we're ready to talk about the next layer of security.
Yeah. What's next? Maybe that becomes a regular feature for us, is just the ongoing free advice from Steve as we fix these problems.
Yeah. And we're excited to announce that Steve has some big news, right?
Yeah. So in the funny business of podcasting, we actually recorded Steve's episode before he made an announcement of what his next thing was going to be. So I guess I'm happy to announce, because I'm excited for him, is he's created a new company called Crucial Technology Group, and Crucial is spelled with an X in the middle. So he's gone late or something to that effect at this point. But yeah, launching his own consultancy. I think we touched on a little bit around the concept of, it's not just for compliance. It's, you got to start with the fundamentals. You got to make sure those are solid, and then you got to build from there to what you need for compliance, but also what you need to protect your data and your company. So he's really focused in on that. He's planning on building a business around it. So I think he's on to a really good start. He's somebody I would highly recommend. He's got my recommendation if anybody out there is looking for a consultant to kind of help them plan their security and compliance business. Yeah, they're offering like virtual CISO, network design and architecture, security program assessment, and policy procedure development. So definitely alignment with compliance and security based off of main industry regulations, as well as some of the benchmark frameworks that we know that Steve is passionate about. So I know he's done many an audit before, so I'm sure he can support most of your audit needs. And that website that you can learn more about Steve Sims on LinkedIn by searching Steve Sims, and then Crucial Technology. And again, that's Crucial with an X, and you can visit their website at crucialtech.com, CRUXIAL tech.com. Yep. So go check Steve out, learn more from him. I'm sure we'll have him on again, because he's an easy guest for us to get to, and has more than enough to help us fill many, many episodes. So look forward to hearing more from him, and let us know what you thought. Yeah, we'd love to hear the feedback. But
we are the champions.
That's all we got for today.
We are the champions of asset management, and hopefully next time we'll talk about something else. So thanks for joining us.
Yep. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.